All right, class. Hope you guys had a great weekend. But we're gonna have to get into some actual work. Hey, I know, I get it, man. I want to sit around, talk shop, and all that stuff, but we got to do what we got to do. So, we're gonna start our unit on World War II, and before we get into all like the sexy battles and the beating up Hitler and all that stuff in the Pacific and such. We're gonna look at it. We're gonna look at World War II as not a lot of people look at it, and I think this is pretty important. We're gonna look at it at World War II as a resource war. And if you don't know what that means right off the bat, we're gonna go ahead and I'll explain it as we go. But first off, we have some setup here. So 1939. What's going on in Europe? Well, essentially, the clouds of war are coming towards Europe. Hitler has already eaten Austria, and he's looking at Czechoslovakia as a nice piece of dessert there, and it's right there. It has like those little lines to it. And Italy, the Italians had already taken control of Albania. And then we have in Asia, in the east, part of China had already been taken by Japan. This top part, it's called Manchuria. It's the closest to Japan. It also it includes the Koreas right there, but they're not like really the Koreas yet. Um, and for all intents and purposes, Asia and the East, they're already at war. They're already fighting. So let's see, what's most important right now? So think of it in terms of a resource war. What's most important whenever you're going before you're getting into a war, into getting into a war, and then actually like fighting it? Well, money. You need money. Um, you need to be able to pay for labor. You need to be able to pay for your soldiers. You need to be able to pay for these factories to build these war materials. Speaking of which, you're going to need natural resources. It's kind of hard to make like bullets if you don't have brass, if you don't have gunpowder. It's kind of hard to power your machines of war if you don't have coal, if you don't have oil. Natural resources are incredibly important, and industrialization. So let's say you have the money and you have the natural resources. You need to be able to make this stuff. If you go out in your garage or go out in your yard, I want you to try to build a tank. Not really going to work. You need factories, you need machinery, and you need laborers for that, bringing the money. Then you need stuff to be able to make the war materials, its natural resources. All these three things, what I see as the most important things when carrying out a resource force such as World War II. People thought that the nations of Europe weren't going to go to war because their economies couldn't handle it. Um, but this didn't stop the First World War, and clearly it's not going to stop the Second. So let's look at these countries involved and what they had to work with. So we have the European nations. Germany, largely landlocked. There's going to be a map that comes here, and I'll be able to show you better what I mean. It's largely landlocked, no colonies, wasn't a colonial power, and it had the Blitzkrieg. We're going to get back to that. Italy, same thing, mostly landlocked, was not a big colonial power. However, now we're looking at the Allies. We're going to look at France and Britain. France had invested in a lot of static defenses, and they had a bunch of colonies. And static defenses are things like bases, turrets, like trenches, stuff like that. And Britain also, they're called the British Empire. They had a lot of colonies all over the world. And they started up their navy again after the Washington Naval Treaty, which we'll talk about later. And so here's what I'm talking about here. So you have Germany. They have access to the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, and they can get out into the Atlantic and the English Channel. But obviously, when Hitler takes control and they start beating up a lot of people here in Europe, these are not going to be very accessible waterways for them to use. Same thing here in Italy. Spain's going to be neutral, but they have that little Iberian Peninsula there. They have that little strait. I think that's the Strait of Gibraltar. But they have the, they have the Ionian Sea. They have more places to go than Germany does. But then again, not a lot of people want to work with them, and clearly. So then we have in Asia. So China lost conventional warfare extremely fast. They have a large population, but it wasn't extremely developed. So Japan was able to come in there and kind of like steamroll them easily. However, they were never able to completely control the Chinese because of their great population. A lot of resistance movements had flared up, and so Japan was never fully in control of China. But they weren't able to exactly keep things unlocked. So what does this mean here? We're gonna go back to Blitzkrieg. So if any of you guys watch football, if any of you guys enjoy watching football, there is a defensive play called the blitz, where the defense will send more rushers toward the quarterback than the offense has blockers. This is meant to overwhelm the offense. Well, that's what the Blitzkrieg was. And since Germany was so landlocked and didn't have colonies, they only had what was right there. The Blitzkrieg wasn't just a strategy to win the war, it was a necessity, because if they couldn't get the resources that they need, that we'll talk later about in this PowerPoint, they couldn't get those resources that they need, they were basically going to lose the war before they even got a chance to really fight it. So yeah, the Blitzkrieg, it wasn't just a strategy, it was kind of like a way of life. And now we have the two wild cards of World War II. We're going to have the USSR, vast natural resources, huge population, but not a very complex economy. They had a lot of people, a lot of natural resources, but they weren't super advanced. If memory serves correct, they were still dealing with, I think, the remnants of the feudal system. I don't think that they had, let me come back to that. I forget the name, like indentured servants, kinda. They weren't slaves. Helots? Something around that. I'll get that later. And then we have the United States. More GDP, gross domestic product, basically what a country could make, than all of these countries that were involved in the war combined, even with the colonies of the British and the French. Crazy. And they were protected by oceans, so there wasn't really a good way to be able to invade the United States from any of these guys here. And so, flash forward to 1941. So, what's happened in the 2 years? Well, in Europe, France fell and Britain was on the ropes. They were kind of getting, daddy whacked over here. Britain was holding out as much as they could, but it was only a matter of time before they eventually succumbed to Hitler and the Nazi forces. And America wasn't there to help. We're going to get back into America here in a second. But then we're going to go over to Asia real quick. Really, the Japanese had expanded so much through the Pacific. They were harassing French and British colonies, which were already kind of in disarray because war isn't very good for colonies. But now onto the U.S. So where was the United States? Well, they were opposed to all things war. In the 1930s, the U.S. passed the Neutrality Acts. They wouldn't take part, they wouldn't take any sides in a war, and they wouldn't even trade with countries at war. So these precious resources of the United States, all these natural resources, not to mention the labor and industrial power, was not going to helping Britain. This was getting a little dicey. Enter FDR, and this is a cool little political cartoon. It's actually by Dr. Seuss. It says here, the wolf chewed up all the children and spit out their bones. But those were foreign children, and it really didn't matter. This was a criticism of the American isolation of the time, how they were neutral and they didn't want to involve. Many people saw as they were just kind of letting Hitler do whatever he wants. It's almost like doing nothing is more harmful than doing something. But yeah, enter FDR. So he saw how dangerous Hitler was, and he wanted to do something about it. However, the Neutrality Acts kind of kept his hands tied on things. He wanted to lobby for an old position, cash and carry, but Congress wouldn't let him do it. And that was whenever Czechoslovakia was getting eaten 2 years ago, or that's whenever they were getting like set up for dessert. So then Poland fell, and so cash and carry was finally okayed. So what cash and carry was it allowed France and Britain to get supplies from the United States only if they paid with cash, cold hard cash, and they had to pay up front, and they had to come get it. No U.S. ship was going to enter a war field or a war zone. Was not going to happen. And this worked, and it helped, but over time, you only have so much cold hard cash. Britain's reserves were completely empty. It's like in cartoons when they pull out their wallet and the fly flies out. That's what Britain was like. So, essentially, things were looking rough. However, the Battle of Britain, which we will talk about later when we get into like the nitty gritty, Battle of Britain was won. So the U.S. kind of had to think of more long-term things. And so FDR created a policy, a cash and carry, which allowed for the exchange of warships for bases in British colonies. This was really stretching cash and carry because technically the British were trading for the ships instead of buying them, which was okay. And ships do a pretty good job of transporting themselves. But this kind of really shows you how dire the situation was. FDR could have and probably should have gotten arrested and thrown in prison for this. He betrayed the Neutrality Acts. He was acting out of order of a president. It was a really dicey situation. But like I mentioned, the Battle of Britain was won, and so we had to think of some new things. So in terms of long-term help, it was time for Lend-Lease. With this, America had finally chosen a side and really threw itself into helping the British. So what was Lend-Lease? Basically, Lend-Lease was that the U.S. would give its strategic partners, and we're going to say strategic partners because they weren't allies yet, because they weren't technically in the war yet, so much war material. The largest donation of war materials in the entire world. These are things like trucks, bombs, food, even stuff like telephone wiring, trucks, clothes, even train cars. This was crazy, and it really brought the U.S. out of the Great Depression. That's the main effect of Lend-Lease. And it's easy to look back now and be like, oh man, America was all for fighting Hitler and the fascists and wanted to support Britain. But in reality, the Senate was split down lines and it almost didn't pass. The funny thing about Lend-Lease, though, is that we donated war materials, and the only catch was that at the end of the war, those war materials had to be returned back to us. Now, look, when you loan out war materials, they kind of don't come back in the condition that you lent them out in, which we knew. It was a really sly way of picking a side without saying it. So that's a little bit of a funny play there by us. So now we're gonna get really nitty to the resource war part of this, and how the resources dictated war planning. And this kind of goes back to Blitzkrieg. Germany, they had the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Really, what was going to happen here is everyone that Germany was trading with to get most of their natural resources was going to stop because of war, and they were going to be trying to beat up and take over most of them. So the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a alliance with the Soviet Union, and it basically guaranteed lots of oil and some other supplies from the Soviet Union, and give them a buffer on their side here, so they wouldn't have to fight a two-side war. That's kind of how they lost World War One. They ended up having to fight a two-pronged war. Never a good thing. Then Norway and Sweden. Norway had tons of aluminum, which is important it's important war material. So that's why they came up here and they took over Norway. And then if you can take over Norway, and they're already pretty close to it anyway, you can kind of get into Sweden, and you can get the iron supplies of Sweden, another important war material. And then France, with an army that big, and you see how large this is, you got to be able to feed these guys. France was the most fertile place in Europe, so that's where they could get most of their grain and bread and such. And if you look at it, it's pretty smart, and that's kind of why Blitzkrieg was so important. They needed to get out to these places, and they needed to get that alliance with the Soviet Union, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and they needed to get to these places that they could get all their materials to be able to sustain their war effort. The only thing that they really struggled with was oil. That kind of blew up their plans, and I know this is the resource war part of it. We will talk about that later because it goes more into war planning. But I figured it would be a better place to not put it here. Now we're gonna look over at Japan. Oh, excuse me. So in Japan, there were two prevailing theories at the time for what the army should do, because the person that Japan was getting most of their trade done with was the United States. And when they sided with Nazi Germany, and then they started taking over China, taking over places in the Pacific, we banned trade with them all out, and so did most of these other European nations that weren't aligned with the fascists. So we have a Hokushin-ron, which is the Northern Expansion Doctrine, which the idea was that in Japan they would push up through China into Siberia and hurt the Soviet Union while also getting a lot of natural resources. Eventually that stalled out. They lost some battles in Mongolia, and so that kind of really stalled out there. So then we had Nanshin-ron, or the Southern Expansion Doctrine, which basically said that Japan would get their natural resources and what they needed through these islands in the Pacific, through Indonesia, the Philippines. They'd get their resources from there. So these are kind of like, you see, because very not a non-colonial power in Japan. They didn't really have a lot here. They didn't have anything down here, so they're kind of constricted in their island nation. That's why they went. That's why they had these two doctrines to try to make up for the lack of natural resources that they had. Same thing with the stuff with Nazi Germany. This is why they did what they did, and those things will be on the quiz for this. So we're going to look at the effects from the resource war and what we feel today. So the main thing I want to talk about here is, how did it start? Japanese expansion and the alignment with the Axis. Essentially, the Allies were, because of this, the Allies were they were deprived of one very special resource, one very specific one that you wouldn't think is too terribly important, but once you see it and once you hear it, you're gonna be like, oh my, yeah, that makes sense, because you don't even really think about it. What it was rubber. Almost all of the world's rubber production at this time was actually made in the places in the Pacific that the Japanese had taken over. So what does this mean for the Allies? No rubber. What they do? They synthesized it. Techniques for synthesizing rubber came back in the 40s, and they still underpin how we do it today. As you can see here, here's some properties of synthetic rubber and tires. Your tires are made of synthetic rubber. Synthetic rubber came around because of World War II, because the Japanese took over those islands in the Pacific where most of the rubber was made. So, these nations had to think of something else to do. And it's kind of really crazy when you think about that, because what's important about the rubber thing? Synthetics became a more widespread thing. And if World War I was the first modern war where they had the machine guns and everything, World War II, I would say, was the first scientific war. Without synthetics, the war might have been lost, and the world itself would be different. So really, what's important here is that if you ever want to know how or why a war started, or how or why a nation or a people in a war do something, follow the resources. It's more useful than you think, and you'll find more through that. So, I hope you guys enjoyed the lesson today. We went a little bit over the allotted time that we were supposed to, but that's okay. We can make up time somewhere else. Quiz next time. Expect you guys to be there. Study guides, you guys have those. Make sure you fill them out. You will get participation points for that to make up for other things. So just kind of be like free points. I don't want to say extra credit, because it kind of makes you sound like a nerd. And it's okay to be a nerd. I'm a nerd. It's not a bad thing, but some people don't like that. Um, but yeah, that was the lesson today. I hope you guys have a nice rest of your day. Be nice to your other teachers and be nice to each other. Have a nice day, guys.